Welcome back. On Viewpoint today, we touch upon the ongoing Group of Seven summit in Germany against the backdrop of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its aggravation, that is, of economic challenges worldwide, as well as calls for concrete climate commitment. For more, I have Professor Robert Kelly at Pusan National University. Professor Kelly, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
I also have Dr. Miriam Prys-Hansen at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies. Dr. Prys-Hansen, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Right, Doctor, you can hear me, right? Doctor, I'm afraid we can't hear you. Can you hear me? Right, and while you turn on
your... Yes, I can hear very well. I'm very sorry.
There we are. Your volume's up now.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Professor Kelly, let's start with you then. Let's start off, Professor, with a few words on the significance of summits like the G7 in Germany amid the host of current global challenges, if you will.
Sure. So the G7 is something like a coordinating committee, I suppose you might say, of democratic capitalist states, right? It really sort of began during the Cold War as a way to coordinate, roughly speaking, Western economic strategy in the context of the challenge of Soviet communism. And it's kind of grown, I think, again, into this kind of vague, informal coordinating committee. I think there's also the G20, which is a little bit larger, which has sort of become something more important in the last 10 or 20 years as the world economy has sort of spread away from the West. But you still have basically sort of this Western core, right, plus Japan, and that's really what the G7 is. And it often gets overtaken by political events, just as you have pointed out, right? In this case, it's the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is, the greatest threat to European security, arguably since World War II. And so really that's often the focus, right? And that's what you're seeing now, these security issues.
Right. And Dr. Prys-Hansen, thousands took to the streets, I believe, in Munich this past weekend, demanding less talk and more action by the G7 on climate change. That being said, do you expect any tangible advances on this particular front during the latest G7 gathering, Dr. Prys-Hansen?
Yeah, thanks for the question. First, this is really important that we do not lose track on this. The German government, before the Ukraine invasion, formulated clearly that enhanced climate action is to be the first and foremost priority of its G7 presidency. And the foreign ministers have actually agreed upon some of the important steps regarding decarbonization of energy supply and some more modest suggestions regarding a coal phase out and the phase off of fossil fuels subsidies. In addition, loss and damage was really managed for the first time in terms of a traditional, in addition to the traditional commitments to provide more climate finance. I think the most well-discussed idea, and I think we're going to hear much more about this, was the foundation of the so-called climate club, starting with the G7 members, where there was something like a common carbon price, and in addition, there would be protection from competition with something like a carbon border adjustment measures. But I think there's considerable hurdles on this way. So I can go into a little bit more if you like, but I think that's what we're going to hear a lot about. So my hopes are, modest in terms of climate change measures, but I think we will hear a lot about this.
Right, we'll keep our fingers crossed for that, of course. Meanwhile, Professor Kelly, going back to the Ukraine situation, some pundits say the G7 summit may provide German Chancellor Olaf Scholz a chance to capitalize on playing host by adopting perhaps a more assertive leadership regarding the crisis in Ukraine. What are your thoughts?
Well, I would certainly hope so. I think the Ukraine crisis really sort of in the West, I think the Ukraine crisis really should primarily be handled by the Europeans. I mean, it really is on their doorstep, and the United States is getting stuck deeper and deeper into Asia for obvious reasons, right? The rise of China. I think, generally speaking, for Western strategy, it would be good if the United States were to sort of take care of Pacific issues and the Europeans were to take care of European issues. I think it would be great if the Germans would actually sort of push for more integrated European military coordination, not necessarily an army, but at least something. I think it would be great if the Germans spent more on defense so they could actually provide resources more directly to Ukraine. I think the Germans have sort of, quite honestly, not done enough on this in the last 20 years or so. But Germany is the biggest economy in Europe, right? And if we're going to have a European Union with a real defense identity, it's going to require that the Germans make a pretty significant change in the way they have chosen to spend on defense in the last 20 years. And I think this is sort of a really hot debate. I mean, your other guests would know better than I would, but my sense is that this is actually a pretty hot debate in Germany right now, and the chancellor is really, sort of on the spot to really make a decision on this. Because, I mean, ultimately, in time, the Americans are going to get pulled away, right? I mean, the Americans are going to get sucked deeper and deeper into Asia because of the China challenge. And the Europeans, I would argue, have to sort of adapt to that at some point. And, Putin, I think, is pushing that along with his invasion.
Right, and staying with that, perhaps that is why, Dr. Prys-Hansen, a few observers, especially over there in Germany, France, as well as Italy, have raised the option of ending Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with the latter surrendering some territory to the former. Now, in response, countries like the UK, Poland, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania have rejected this option, claiming it will only lead to further Russian aggression in the future. Where do you stand on this particular debate?
Well, obviously, this is a very difficult question, and obviously any way to end this war, to end the human suffering it causes in Ukraine, but also beyond through the food crisis, would be great. However, I think at this point, I do not see the room for peace negotiations. I do not see that Ukraine would be ready to engage in this, and I actually do not see Russia partaking in this in any trustworthy manner as well. So the signals that are coming out of Russia do not point in this direction, I think, and I do not think it's upon anyone outside the Ukraine to tell them to surrender. So anyway, a way needs to be found, but I'm actually quite pessimistic in this regard. So I think for the moment and probably for the next future, the support to Ukraine needs to continue, and I don't think that there will be anything but this happening at the G7 as well.
Right, and against that backdrop then, Professor Kelly, a recent cross-Europe opinion poll shows that quite a number of people believe tackling the cost of living crisis needs to take priority over efforts to perhaps punish Russia. How does this public sentiment in Europe look to affect its leaders' commitment to supporting Ukraine in the long run?
Yeah, and I would argue that's pretty troublesome, right? I mean, ultimately, I would argue that what's happening in Ukraine is significantly more important to all of us, not just in Europe, but all of us really, than things like inflation or the cost of gasoline. I mean, it's important to remember just what exactly the Russians are doing in Ukraine, right? I mean, they're operating something like death squads behind the lines, I mean, where they're sort of handcuffing people and shooting them. I mean, this is pretty serious stuff. I mean, Russia is sort of becoming a sort of quasi-fascist state engaging in pretty severe war crimes. And I'm kind of shocked that all of us in the democratic world are saying, well, you know, we should sort of push Ukraine towards concessions because gas prices are high. I mean, that just sort of strikes me as sort of like morally just sort of grotesque. And I'm hoping so far Europe's elites have, I think, really sort of held the line on this, as I think has President Biden back in the United States. But I mean, I think we need to get our priorities straight here. I mean, I'm just looking at the footage you're running right now of Ukraine. I mean, that's what's happening to these people. And we're talking about, you know, whether or not we're going to pay an extra 20% for gasoline. I mean, I just don't understand that the measure of those two things. I mean, Russia has become a genuine threat to European security and to human security in Europe, right? Particularly again with its war crimes behavior. And to me, the case for supporting Ukraine, even if there are financial costs and economic costs elsewhere, is actually pretty strong.
Right, to say the least, of course. And briefly speaking, Dr. Prys-Hansen, what can you share with us about the German public's sentiment with regard to the government's ongoing support of Ukraine against Russia?
Yes, there was recently a big opinion poll by the European Council on Foreign Relations, which shows quite clearly that in comparison to states such as Italy, the German public is still quite hawkish, but I think support is actually unfortunately going down. So if we look at some of the numbers, so most Germans still mainly blame Russia for the war, and they differ over. They don't differ about who represents the biggest threat in this. So, and 63% in Germany believe the answer to this question, who's to blame, is Russia. But only 39% of Italians agree. So I think we will see going in across countries the support to go down. I do think, however, in Germany, most people at this point support, for example, more than 50%, for example, support the sending of additional arms and military supplies to the Ukrainian government. Also, that additional troops should be sent to NATO, Eastern NATO members. And what probably makes the most difference in the long run, Germans back increasing defense spending. I mean, this has been the biggest issue in the German debate about this as well. And about 50% still increase this defense, support the increase of defense spending, which is an enormous shift to previous public opinion. So I think that cannot be underestimated in this regard.
Right, I see. And Dr. Prys-Hansen, just ahead of the G7 summit, leaders of the 5 major emerging economies, that would be Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, gathered virtually for the 2022 BRICS summit chaired by Beijing last week. Now, a key agenda was the possible expansion of this gathering to include more members. Which countries do you suppose are on the list, and how does this expansion perhaps look to affect international order, so to speak?
Yeah, thank you for this question, which is actually a very interesting one, as it illustrates some of the central dynamics within BRICS in general. So China is the clearest and biggest proponent of BRICS expansion. And among the more credible candidates are clearly Indonesia, Argentina, other guests to the so-called BRICS Plus format this year were Egypt, Kazakhstan, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Senegal, and a few others. But as said, this seems to be mainly a China agenda. And India, for example, is incredibly wary of any expansion of Chinese influence or even domination within BRICS. So what happened regarding the expansion at this year's summits is actually quite telling. So China, as the host, had the clear intention to bring BRICS expansion on the way. India opposed this. And if we look at the final document, the Beijing Summit Declaration, we can see how India and possibly also some of the other BRICS refused to grant this wish to China. Instead, somewhere towards the end of the document, it said that BRICS supports further debate on BRICS expansion, but only if frameworks, rules, procedures, I'm paraphrasing here, are clarified. So this sounded to me like a loud and clear diplomatic no to me. So I don't think we will see this happening at any point soon.
Right, I see. Professor Keller, the G7 summit this year has invited Senegal, Argentina, Indonesia, India and South Africa. The last two guests, of course, are members of BRICS. What can you tell us about this year's list of invitees and perhaps the G7's intentions?
Sure. So I think the G7 has come under a fair amount of criticism in the last couple of decades since the end of the Cold War and through the rise of neoliberalism, if you will. The G7 has come under a lot of criticism that it doesn't do enough for the global developing world, particularly for the global South, for the developing world. All right, and I think it's been sort of sensitive to that point and has made efforts to sort of pull in those states. I think the G7 has pushed the IMF, for example, to be a little bit more lenient on things like conditionality on loans to poor countries. I also think there's concern about maintaining some kind of durable anti-Russian coalition that extends beyond the West and a few token countries in Asia like Japan and South Korea, right? I mean, there is sort of a concern out there that this thing, that the Ukraine conflict is really turning into this kind of proxy war between the West and Russia, you know, with Japan and South Korea, again, sort of on the side, and the rest of the global South is kind of hedging. And I think that's what's happening. And so I think that's part of what this is, right? This is an effort to see if we can sort of pull some of these states in, right? Sort of convince sort of countries out there outside of the West that, look, the Russian behavior, sort of like chewing up countries and sort of pulling off bits and pieces of them, represents a threat to you too, right? You wouldn't want the Chinese to do this to you, for example, right? And so I think that's what you're seeing here, right? You're seeing an effort to kind of widen this anti-Russian coalition, particularly because the war is probably going to drag on, right? The war's not going to end soon, right? Even if we try to push the Ukrainians to give up, they're not going to do it. Like Kissinger said, they're not going to do it, right? And so this thing is going to probably drag on for a while. Even if the Russians win, it's going to turn in Afghanistan. It's going to become a big sort of partisan thing. You know, you're going to have sort of like a rebel movement. It's going to turn in like Vietnam or Afghanistan or something like that. It's going to drag on for 4 or 5 years, right? And so I think Western leaders are starting to grasp that and are starting to look to widen the coalition for something that's going to go on for a while.
Right. Meanwhile, Dr. Prys-Hansen, aside from the conflict in Ukraine and climate change, G7 leaders are also looking to carefully craft global economic responses as the United Nations has warned of an unprecedented global hunger crisis. Now, some believe that the problem has little to do with production and more to do with the distribution of food. And that being said, what efforts might serve to perhaps ease global hunger?
Yeah, thanks. Again, this is a crisis which absolutely cannot be ignored and for which the G7 can and has to take on responsibility and bring measures on the way, both for the respective national agendas, but also in preparation of the G20 and other multilateral meetings. Among the first things regarding food security is obviously finding ways to get grain and wheat out of Ukraine. So I'm sure we will hear something about that. But issues, as you say in your question, are more structural beyond the Ukraine crisis. Even so, in the May meeting at the G7 agricultural ministers, the key topic was the transformation of food systems, which speaks to the issue that it's not production alone that's causing the problem, but the system, the overall organization as such. Second topic, also telling, was sustainable supply chains, again speaking to the issue of distribution. One of the key things that can be done in this regard is the strengthening of production in the global South. And one of the other sort of part of that may be a more trickier aspect regarding at the G7, also in light of the outreach guests that were just mentioned, including India, maybe that the G7 announce and strive to, and I quote here, to avoid signals and undue measures that restrict exports and lead to further increases in food input prices. This is in light of Indians' export ban on wheat. So I'm curious, and I hope that a solution will be found. And I think we're going to hear more about that, particularly in light of the Ukraine crisis. There was, for example, the announcement of a global alliance on food security. That's what was suggested both at the agricultural and development ministers meetings in May, in order to help also in the crisis as such, so the most devastating consequences for the most vulnerable right now, but also to support development agencies and other agencies in this area to find more sustainable ways of doing things in the future.
Right. And back on the political front, then, Professor Kelly, Ukraine and Moldova were recently granted EU candidate status. Now, Russian President Vladimir Putin, that is, has insisted he has nothing against Ukraine joining the EU, but Kremlin claims it will give the application increased attention because the EU is considering its own defense force. Now, does this status look to affect tensions between Kyiv and Moscow, do you think?
Yeah, I think that EU status, EU membership is actually a decent peace possibility for the Ukraine conflict, right? The Ukrainians pretty clearly want Western integration or some measure of Western integration at this point, right? The Russians don't, right? Particularly, they're very concerned about security integration, which is to say NATO, right? And so I think that one way to sort of split the difference would be to say, okay, the Ukrainians don't get into NATO. I mean, nobody really believes it's going to happen anyway. But we will let the Ukrainians get into the European Union. This would allow the Ukrainians to export more substantially, right, with sort of less transaction costs to Western Europe, particularly to Germany, I might add, right? And that would be sort of like a decent halfway house, right? I have the feeling whenever this thing actually sort of rolls into negotiations, probably sometime before the end of the year, this is actually going to be one of the things that people agree on, right? No NATO, but you do get the European Union. And the European Union could also provide a lot of the reconstruction assistance that's going to be necessary in Ukraine, which the Russians aren't going to want to give. I mean, we're not really talking about that. That's sort of like 5 or 6 steps down the road at this point, right? But it's going to require a lot of money to put Ukraine back on its feet. And, the Russians are not going to want to pay for that. They're just not going to want to do it. And the European Union would be an alternative for that. So I actually like the idea of European candidate status for Ukraine. I mean, I think it gives us something of this off-ramp we've heard so much about. But again, as your other guest mentioned, and Putin just doesn't sound like he's very interested in this, right? I mean, it really looks like he's going to try to win, or at least pound Ukraine into the ground in the next few months to reduce it substantially. So I think the value of European membership, EU membership, is maybe 6 months or 12 months away when we get to negotiations. But again, I think it provides a sort of halfway. It's like a half kind of solution, right? You don't get NATO, but you get the EU. That's not bad. That's a decent compromise, I think.
Right, a decent compromise right there. All right, Professor Keller, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thanks,
and Dr. Prys-Hansen over in Germany, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me.